Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. This is Purple Shots, where we are interviewing Jeff Shots.
How's it going, guys?
Not bad, yourself?
How are you?
Doing pretty well. It's been a long day, but I'm all right.
Haven't we all had that today?
Tell the dear audience about yourself. A radical new atheist / anti-theist that converted to Christianity, and you're Catholic in particular.
Yeah. Do you want me to just give like some of the background to it, or because How did you guys find out about me?
A friend of ours, John Smith.
Okay. I'm guessing you like found my blog or something or Reddit posts.
Yeah.
Basically, I was raised kind of like a fundamentalist Baptist Christian, and I was also homeschooled, so it was pretty much all I knew.
That usually starts it.
Yeah. And so basically, we believe like Earth is 6,000 years old, evolution is nonsense, this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also, and then we moved to Tennessee, which is like the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. And while we were there, I encountered people that were atheists for the first time, pretty much. And since in Tennessee, if you're an atheist, you kind of get a lot of flack for it. They tend to be pretty outspoken. So they questioned me on my views a lot. But the thing is that they didn't really attack my theological beliefs. They just kind of tried to prove to me that the scientific positions that I was taught were bogus. And it didn't take long for me to realize that the Earth is definitely older than 6,000 years old and that there is pretty substantial evidence for things like evolution. So that led me down the path of kind of feeling like I'd been lied to, essentially, and that I wasn't sure about Christianity anymore, which led me to start studying basically every other religion. And this was around the time when the new atheists were really big on YouTube and everything, so I kind of got wrapped up in that and ended up going even further down that path, basically.
So what is it in particular that led you to initially convert to atheism?
It was basically I wasn't able to reconcile what I could tell was true scientifically with the positions that I had been taught were true when you have like a literalist fundamentalist reading of, for example, like the creation account in Genesis. And I didn't understand that there were other perspectives in Christianity. So when I found out that the scientific positions I had been taught were wrong, I kind of just associated that with the truth of Christianity as a whole. And it wasn't until later that I really started to realize that there are ways that Christians believe that allow for scientific knowledge, and that actually literalism and kind of young earth creationism are actually pretty recent innovations that don't represent historic Christianity.
I know they only really date back to, if we're going to be specific, like to the 1960s.
Yeah. So
yeah, even further back to the 19th century, even though it was small then, the Seventh-day Adventists.
Yeah. And when you read what kind of really helped me start going down the road to Catholicism specifically was reading what the earliest Christians believed. Because when I came back to Christianity, which is like a whole story in itself, but I asked myself the question, now what kind of Christian do I want to be? Or what kind of Christianity is actually true? So what I did was I started reading, the church fathers, St. Augustine, St. Jerome, St. Ignatius of Antioch, people like that, and found out that what they were saying was a lot different than the Christianity I had been taught as a child, and that it made a lot more sense to me. So that kind of helped me back onto the path or down to Catholicism.
I think they'll name one of the church fathers that was what we would call a young earth creationist, but it wasn't really a dogma then.
It wasn't so much specifically whether or not they were young earth creationists, but like, for example, St. Augustine talked about how he advised believers not to reject new secular understandings of things because it contradicted their literal interpretation of the Bible, because if they did so and their interpretation was wrong, then they would basically look like idiots to the rest of the world, and that would hinder the evangelization of pagans.
Right.
Yeah. Well, if only modern day young earth creationists could hear that.
most of them probably don't know who St. Augustine was, let alone what he said about certain things.
Probably.
No, and it was he that argued for the gold of the Egyptians idea that the Christians should take the knowledge from the Greeks and
Yeah.
as opposed to Tertullian, who argued what has Athens to do with Jerusalem and that sort of stuff.
Well, one of the main influences for me intellectually and for all of Catholicism is St. Thomas Aquinas. And he was the one who really brought Aristotelian philosophy into the Christian worldview and synthesized it in that kind of way. It really, if you go back all the way to the New Testament, you start to see those kind of Greco-Roman ideas. I mean, when John the Evangelist refers to Christ as the Logos, the Word. So it's always been there, and the way that Catholics specifically we view it is that we teach that the Catholic Church has the 100% fullness of truth, but that doesn't mean that every other religion or worldview is 0% correct. So lots of religions might be 95% correct, or 90, or 70, or 60.
Then there's also fun fact for the episode. In Chinese Bible translations, the word logos is replaced with a Tao. In the beginning, there was the Tao.
Yeah, because word is a good translation, but basically you could say like logos is the rational principle of reality, the reason you could even say, or something like that.
Similar to what the Tao was in the Chinese religion.
Yeah, exactly.
So tell us. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to continue, but if you have a different question, that's good.
Well,
Go ahead, Brad.
Oh, you just go, since you were going to do it anyway.
Tell us all about your journey to Christianity and what events led you to reconsider your former atheism, and what evidence for God's existence or the resurrection of Christ finally got you.
Yeah. Well, it was... The thing about it was initially kind of like a psychological, emotional draw, and like the actual day that I came back to Christianity, I didn't really understand it yet, and then that just kind of initiated what's now close to like 6 years of continuous study to understand it. But I'll tell you a little bit of background as an atheist. When I was an atheist, like I said, when you live in places like the Bible Belt and you are an atheist, you tend to learn to defend yourself really well, because you're attacked a lot by people who, basically outnumber you 1,000 to 1 or more. And so I was really good. Basically, when I was an atheist, I never stopped being interested in Christianity or religion or philosophy in general. I studied it specifically to make it easier for me to attack Christians, basically. And the problem is that a lot of the people I came across weren't particularly well-formed Christians. So it was really easy for me to feel like that I dominated the debate. But I was also really provocative. So one example is that when I was in high school, we had what's called Spirit Week, which is basically the week before prom. And every day of the week leading up to it had like a different event. And one of them was Fictional Character Day. And I went dressed up as Jesus Christ. And it was a pretty big deal. There was a lawsuit involved because the school made me take it off before the first bell even rang. And so basically I contacted some lawyers who threatened to sue them, basically, for repressing my religious beliefs. And then that got the attention of the local news, who came to my house and interviewed me.
Wow.
If you look up my name, Jeff Shott, and then the word Jesus, you'll get like tens of thousands of results. CNN talked about it. If you're familiar with Reddit, the story was the top post of all of Reddit when me getting the lawsuit taken into place for the dressing up like Jesus. So I was really well known in my circle as an atheist, especially after that incident. And so I just was constantly talking to people, and always never really encountered what I thought was an intelligent Christian. But when that eventually did start happening, and the first guy that I met that particularly impressed me, I don't remember his name. We had a brief interaction, but he was an Eastern Orthodox Christian. And he was the first one who really kind of opened my eyes to the fact that you can be a religious person and not an idiot. And so that kind of, because at that point, before I just thought that
it's
religion,
kind of hard when your only acquaintance with the Christianity is evangelicals.
yeah, and when all you're hearing from like Richard Dawkins and stuff is that it's a delusion. And so I was a big fan of like Christopher Hitchens and stuff. So I was just convinced that it was a delusion and that anybody who had half a brain would just notice like really quickly if you explained it to them. But I started encountering slowly people who were intelligent and religious. And basically, when I was about 19 or just about to be 19, I was not in high school anymore, and I wasn't really associating with a lot of people that I was, and I moved out of the state, so it kind of changed my environment a little bit, and I just kept getting this nagging feeling, maybe you were wrong about Christianity, even though I was like 100% sure that I wasn't. And so I just kept getting this feeling. So basically, one day I just kind of prayed, and I don't even know if you could really call it that because I didn't believe in God, but it wasn't even really a prayer, it was more like a challenge. I basically just said, like, God, I'm pretty sure you don't exist. But if you do, I'm having doubts right now. So if you wanted to show me that you were real, this would be a good time. And in fact, I probably will never second guess myself again. That was pretty much the prayer. And God kind of just like took me up on it. And I won't go into the details unless you want to go into them. But basically what happened is I one day opened up my Bible because I had multiple because I was always arguing with Christians. And after I had prayed that kind of prayer, I read, one or two chapters of Matthew, and then I would put it down. And for about 2 weeks straight, every time I would read the Bible, within like 30 seconds of me putting it down, something would happen that was directly related to what the last few verses I had read or whatever it was. And it was to the point where I just couldn't deny that it was. So like, for example, one day it was the 4th of July and I was reading the Bible and I got to the verses in Matthew where it says, don't cast what is holy before dogs, don't give your pearls to swine. And I closed the Bible, and then literally, like, as my Bible is hitting the desk, I get a knock on the door, and it's my next door neighbor. And he says, hey, it's 4th of July. I noticed you guys aren't doing anything. Do you want to come eat our barbecue? So I walk over, and the first thing anybody at this barbecue says to me is his dad says, I hope you're hungry. Otherwise, we're just going to give all this food to the dogs. And, like, that was just one example of for 2 weeks straight, I would pick up the Bible, read something, and then something immediately would happen. A lot of times things that, in order for them to happen, the events had to start before that day even. And so it didn't really, like I said, this was more of an emotional, psychological thing. And it didn't really intellectually prove to me that God existed. And I still had a lot of questions. But one day I kind of just decided that I would give Christianity a go. And I figured the only way I could ever really know if it was true was if I actually like tried to believe it. And then that's when I started doing the more intellectual research. The first book that I read when I became a Christian again was Soren Kierkegaard's Training in Christianity. And then after that, I read St. Augustine's Confessions. And it kind of opened my eyes to the idea that there was another type of Christianity, that there was a way to understand Christianity that was different than what I was raised. And so for me, what I usually tell people is I like to do apologetics and trying to convince people that Christianity is true. But I think the first step you have to take is not determine whether or not Christianity is true, but to determine what true Christianity is. Because if you don't know what true Christianity is and you're trying to prove it to somebody or disprove it, you're going to be either attacking a straw man or presenting something to someone that is short of the truth and is therefore easier for them to reject. So that was a big part of my journey, was for like the first 3 years after I decided to become a Christian again, I just basically day and night was studying the different types of Christianity and the different biblical and arguments from traditions for the different beliefs about things. And that's how I eventually wound up in the Catholic Church.
What's been your... Go ahead, Bryce.
Yeah, I actually found that very interesting. I didn't know about the whole...
Roboting again.
I said I didn't know about the entire incident with the you dressing up as Jesus. I thought that was funny, however. I thought it was funny that with the Jesus dress up. I thought that's something I hear a lot of atheists saying that they've done or something.
Mm-hmm.
maybe you inspired them.
There's only when I did it, there was only one other person I had heard of before who did it. I didn't find out about him until after I did it, but the reason I found out about him is because he had contacted the same group of lawyers, and so when I was talking to them, they were, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and,
they're the only lawyers that deal with this.
Yeah. And so they were the ones who really got it in the open. One interesting thing was, I forget his name right now, but there's a guy who's an atheist, and he wrote this book called Nailed, and it's called like the 9 proofs that Jesus Christ never existed at all, or something like that. And he sent me a signed copy of it when he heard about the story. And yeah, I still have it. But I after a while, I came to realize that the idea that Jesus didn't exist at all, not that just the belief that he isn't God, but that he didn't exist even as a historical person, is a super fringe, scholarly position that almost, nobody takes it that has any relevant education in that field.
It's the younger Christianists, or at this point, flat eartherism of
atheism, yeah, mythicism, or
Speaking on the related note, who was your patron saint as an atheist activist?
You mean like my favorite atheist speaker?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was a big fan of Christopher Hitchens. Actually, when Christopher Hitchens died, they put out a call, kind of like on the atheist internets, that they wanted to film a goodbye YouTube video before he died so that they could show it to him, because they knew he was going to be dying within a couple of months, and I'm in that video.
Wow.
Yeah. I look way different back then. I had hair down to here, and I'm wearing like a tie-dye. I was just like totally, the typical edgy teenage, rebel or whatever. But I wasn't even old enough to drink yet. But like the whole point of it was, it's a toast to Hitchens, and it's just me holding like a plastic cup that had like orange juice or something in it, talking about how like I was woke now because Christopher Hitchens, enlightened my soul or something. So yeah, I was deep into it. Yeah,
now you know better. He's not what people make him out to be. He's not this super intellectual. He was a rhetorician first and foremost.
Yeah, he's extremely rhetorically savvy. But when you actually break down the arguments, and that's kind of what happened to me, was, what I do with people now is, a lot of times when I talk to atheists now, after the conversation, they'll say something to me like, I've never had a conversation with a Christian before that actually understood why I don't believe and had something meaningful to say in response. And that's because I tell them, hey, I had to answer every single question for myself that you're posing to me now. And a lot of times atheists will feel more comfortable talking to me, because when I tell them my story about, what I did and who I was and dressing up like Jesus and stuff, they kind of realize that they're not going to offend me or say something that, is,
right.
I mean, like I guarantee
you've been through it all.
I did worse than you're going to say to me. So it makes it easier to have dialogue with people when you have been on the other side of it. And I think that's kind of why God allowed me to go that path and to go so deep into it, because now I have all those pathways kind of built in my brain where if I wanted to, I could just kind of switch back into that mode and probably argue atheism better than they could back to them. And then, show why I don't think that anymore.
I like that method. Me and Brass give back what we get. Simple.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was saying, like, I was looking at your blog a little bit, and I noticed that you were talking about traditional marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And I was seeing how you talked about the unitive and procreative functions of marriage.
Yeah.
Are you, by any chance, a natural law theorist or a Thomist or whatever?
I already said, Thomas Aquinas is a big influence on my thinking, and yeah, I would say I like natural law. It makes a lot of sense to me. That's how a lot of my thinking goes.
That is interesting. I've always been curious about getting a natural law theory because I've always been interested in it, especially the more secular forms of natural law theory, which are out there as well.
Natural law is a huge strain in Catholic theology, and it's something that you don't really find in the Protestant intellectual tradition. So when you are a Catholic and you're arguing, different things, it makes it easier to discuss with non-believers, because you don't always just have to say, 'cause the Bible, says so. Not that like the Bible saying so is a bad reason to believe something, but if you can't really pull that authority all the time when you're talking to somebody who thinks it's a goat herder's diary or whatever. So when you're talking to people, so for example, I like talking about pro-life issues and abortion, and almost 100% of the time when I start the conversation, people assume that I'm going to be pulling some sort of religious, trick out of my sleeve, but I make a point to not reference God at all, because then they can't just dismiss it as a religious argument. They have to actually engage with the premises. And so that's why I think natural law is so useful, because if you're a religious person who thinks that your beliefs can be come to as conclusions from another starting point, it makes it a lot easier to discuss with other people. If you're saying, well, let's not even talk about the Bible, let's just assume, we can look at nature and use reason to determine different aspects of ethics and stuff like that. And so it's a good starting point.
And I found that's actually pretty good when dealing with atheists, because they're all about science. It's you take the scientific sort of approach and mix that in with natural law theory.
Yeah. Well, a lot of atheists don't realize is that science owes a lot to Catholicism. For example, if you look at medieval literature, the number one quoted sentence in all of medieval literature is a book from the Catholic Bible. And I say the Catholic Bible because it's one of the books that doesn't exist in Protestant Bibles. It's the Book of Wisdom. And the verse says, I'll paraphrase because I don't actually have it memorized, something along the lines of, and all that God has created, he has done so according to weight, size, and measure. And medieval writers would take this as a basis for the idea that basically evidence and experiment-based testing could be useful, because there's certain things about science you have to presuppose about the universe before you can even do science. And Christianity supplied that to the West. Like, number one, the universe isn't God, because if you believe the universe is God, you don't test it and treat it as a material object. You worship it. So when you say there's a God outside of the universe who created the universe and he did so in an orderly manner, that gives you the philosophical presuppositions necessary to even start doing science. And then when you think about the fact that, for example, a lot of the ancient basilicas, they'll have holes in the ceilings, and they would place the statues and columns in specific places on the floor, so that as the sun came in and cast shadows at different times in the seasons, that they could actually track things about how the universe was working by doing that. And so a lot of what the Catholic Church gave to the West, including its theology, which allowed for the presuppositions necessary, its buildings, its people. I mean, if you look at, the genetics or seismology, all these different scientific fields, if you look back, it's largely Catholic priests and monks who contributed to that. I mean, seismology is called the Jesuit science. The textbook that is used most to teach seismology in colleges and stuff was actually written by a Jesuit priest. And it was because Jesuits have so many missionary outposts all over the world that they can use their seismographs and get data from all the different tectonic points in the planet and then compile it. And they've been doing it for so long because they've been missionaries for so long that they've been able to get a really excellent data set. And so when you kind of share this stuff with people who say, science disproves a religion, it takes a lot of the air out of their sails, basically.
Also, once you give them the academic definition, which is a set of beliefs, arbitrary or otherwise, binding humans into a shared cooperative community and or identity, so it can't be disproved.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's the Durkheimian definition.
Yeah,
still better than the narrow belief in a deity definition.
Fundamentally, science can't disprove God because science is limited to material objects and processes. So when you're talking about a timeless, eternal God who exists outside of the universe, you can't really disprove that. I mean, so I was never 100% strong atheist. I would have definitely put myself in the anti-theist camp, but I would have never gone so far as saying I think you can prove that there's not a God. I would have just said I think you can make a real good case that there's probably not one. But there's a lot of people today who are increasingly in the strong camp.
As a former anti-theist, you were probably on the side of Hitchens in his debate against William Lane Craig, and on Dawkins' side in his debate against John Lennox. So, has your opinion changed on that since then?
About anti-theism and like religion as a force for good?
No, about debates.
Yeah, I've definitely seen debates a lot differently since I became a Christian, but I personally take a different approach when I'm actually talking to people because, like I said, classical evidences, like Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways and stuff like that, like the argument from contingency and stuff, I think are great. But I think and it's just because, when you're talking about, William Lane Craig and Hitchens and Dawkins and Lennox, you're talking about people who are intellectuals that exist in an academic environment. But I feel like those types of arguments don't really have much force for people who are not academics. And that's kind of like the general people that you're going to run across in the world. So I actually have a soft spot for presuppositional apologetics, which is not a traditionally Catholic tactic. And it's not like I use it explicitly, because some people will just be like, you just have to assume God exists and go from there, and I'm not going to give you any evidence because evidence is useless. I don't take that perspective, but the way I see it is people are a lot more willing to listen to what you have to say if you can plant the smallest seed of doubt about their own logical consistency and like the interior consistency of their worldview. So if I can just back up and say, okay, before we talk about why I think God exists, let's ask some examining questions about the logical conclusions of not believing in God. And then if you go from there and you start to get into like relativism and stuff like that, you can pretty easily make a case that even if they don't think that your worldview is great off the bat, that maybe theirs isn't either. And then that opens up the floor a little bit and kind of puts them on the defensive.
Like not many atheists can touch Lennox, but on when they try to debunk trademark Craig, they can't do so without strawmanning the shit out of him or insulting him.
Yeah.
Did you used to be that guy?
I would. There was a bit of that. Yeah, I think. Let me give an example. So, like Thomas Aquinas, basically, when he would talk about things, he would basically set it up as, these are the objections to the position, and this is how I respond to it, and these are like my citations, and this is how I respond to each individual objection. So it was very logical and orderly. And sometimes he would come up with, as much as a dozen or 2 dozen objections before he would even explain why he thought that those objections were wrong. And he was known for what's called steel manning, which is the opposite of straw manning. So he would try to set up the opponent's positions as good as he possibly could and better than they could if possible. And when it came to the question of whether or not God existed, he could only come up with 2 arguments that he thought were even worth addressing. And that was the problem of evil, and basically the idea that you can explain everything without God. And those were kind of the ones that I naturally leaned toward, because they are really the only arguments you can actually make against God, besides just saying, I've never seen any good evidence for there being a God. And that kind of puts you on the defensive, because then people are just going to throw arguments at you, and then you have to prove why they're all wrong. But most atheists that I've come across don't even do that. So like when somebody will say like, well, I've never seen good evidence for God's existence, I'll tell them, well, what's the least worst one you've seen? Like what's the best one, the one that you would, that you would think would be the best one. And a lot of times they can't even come up with one because they haven't really looked into it anyway. But yeah, for me, the thing about like when you get really into militant atheism and anti-theism is it rapidly devolves from being a purely intellectual thing. It kind of becomes its own little religion. And so a lot of people can't really keep up the purely intellectual side of it, and I didn't either. So you end up strawmanning people or just purely resorting to rhetoric. like Christopher Hitchens did. You can make a really good rhetorical case that people be like, oh yeah, that's really impressive, but that's kind of what I ended up doing a lot of the times was just kind of being like, gotcha, but because you didn't even have to give a good argument because they didn't know how to respond to it anyway most of the time.
My favorite, one of my favorite talking points that I like to throw down is that, well, reading the Bible made me an atheist. I'm like, well, yeah, so you didn't read Aristotle, Plato, or any other scholarship or anything like that?
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is because most people who are kind of radical or militant atheists or anti-theists, their problem is that they read the Bible the same way that fundamentalists do. And that's why they come to terrible conclusions about it. Because they will read it and say, look, it says, their universe was created in 6 24-hour periods 6,000 years ago or whatever. And then if you kind of try to tell them, hey, that's not what most Christians throughout time have believed, then they'll just be like, oh, well, you're making up new stuff about religion to, take into account the progress that we've made and stuff. And I'm like, no, it's actually the other way around. People invented the idea that it was a new, 6,000-year-old Earth, and that's 6 24-hour literal periods. That's the new thing.
Like just before this, I had some jagoff tell me that, well, wait, how do you accept evolution? The Bible says God made a man from dirt and created a woman from a rib.
Mm-hmm. It's because people don't understand that the Bible isn't one book, strictly speaking, and that it has many genres in it. I mean, if you're Catholic, the Bible has 73 books in it, and probably a dozen or more different genres in it. And so, like, the way that I look at Genesis, or one way that you could look at Genesis, is it's a creation myth. And I'm not saying myth in the sense that it's untrue.
Yeah, myth back in a practical sense meant stories in a distant past involving gods and stuff.
The way that I see it is, it's a counter myth. So the creation epic in Genesis is very similar to other creation myths that you find, but it's different in key details. And so the message that Genesis is trying to send isn't a scientific, doctoral thesis. This is the things that we believe about God that are different than the other creation myths, and we're going to explain it this way. Because a lot of the old creation myths would be about how, the gods created humanity out of some, vindictive need for entertainment, and then the humans reacted a certain way, and so the gods did this or that. And so, the biblical story says, no, there's one God, and he created humans as the peak of his creation, and it goes on and on. So it's correcting other ancient myths. It's not setting up some sort of literalist scientific account
but they plagiarized it.
Well, it's not the plagiarism. It's you're specifically taking into account the other people's beliefs, and then
Yeah, it was polemic.
Yeah, exactly. It's polemical.
Huh?
It's called polemics.
He says polemics too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's intentionally trying. It's not that if they're borrowing from the story. It's that they're saying this is what other people say, and this is what's really the case.
Yeah.
Yeah,
they're acknowledging
flood. The flood, for instance, will swear that they plagiarized the Epic of Gilgamesh. I'm like, yeah, there's many other versions of that story. Like the flood is the most widely reported event in the ancient world. We know for a fact it happened, but it wasn't global.
It definitely happened, and this is the Christian or Jewish Judeo-Christian understanding of why it happened. And the way that I see it is Catholics believe in biblical inerrancy. So we believe everything the Bible says is true, but what we mean by that is different than a lot of fundamentalists, because when we say everything the Bible says is true, what we mean is everything that the Bible intends to affirm as true is true. So we don't think that the Bible is intending to affirm a 24-hour, literal 6-day creation. We think it's trying to affirm those kind of deeper truths that are being presented in the Genesis creation story. So I would say the same thing about the Exodus or the flood or whatever. We might not believe that everything that it says has to be 100% historically, literally true, and it might be. I'm not saying that it's not, but I'm a lot more comfortable kind of paying a closer attention to the other meanings. Because in Catholic theology, there's like 4 layers of the meanings of the text. There's the literal, and then the metaphorical, and the eschatological, and the ethical, and stuff like that. So as a Catholic, I'm more comfortable saying, putting aside whether or not the flood happened exactly as it says it does historically, what does it mean? And then you can notice that, like in the New Testament, they draw the parallel between the flood and baptism, or like the Exodus and baptism and stuff like that. So like when the Israelites go through the Red Sea, it's a typological foreshadowing of baptism and stuff like that.
And it's also a throwback to the myth of Yahweh slaying Leviathan.
Exactly. So I'm more comfortable seeing it in typological senses. But what I will say is that there are a lot of things that people attack about what should be understood literally and historically that's not true. So, for example, people will say, like, they'll use the telephone story. This is one of the things I talk about in the articles that are on my blog, is people will say, like, oh, well, we can't really know what's historically true about Jesus because it's like the telephone game where people would say this and that. But really, that's not what happened. And the analogy that I use in my articles is more like this. Imagine that your mom had like the best brownie recipe in the city. So 30 of her friends ask her for the brownie recipe, and she gives them her recipe and writes it directly and gives it to them. And then they share it each with 5 people, then they share it each with 5 people or whatever. But then one day, for some weird reason, these 30 originals all get lost or destroyed. Does that mean that we don't have the recipe anymore? No, because then you bring all the existing ones together, and what you find is that, let's say there are 100. So out of the 100, 95 of them say the exact same thing, and then 3 of them say the same thing, but 2 of the steps are out of order, and then the other 2 have like minor grammatical and spelling mistakes. Does that mean we don't know what the original said because there are, grammatical errors and stuff? No. And that's what most of the differences in the New Testament manuscripts are, is just grammatical stuff. Even atheists like Bart Ehrman will say that the differences in the New Testament manuscripts don't affect any core doctrine of Christianity. So it doesn't actually change what Christians believe, because they'll say, oh, there's 100,000 differences. And it's like, yeah, like one of them says this Greek letter, and the other one says this one, and it's easy to do that because they didn't use spaces or capitalization or punctuation, So.
Okay, speaking of Bart Ehrman, he gets more hate from the mythicists than any rabid Bible-waving evangelical.
Yeah, because he's at least honest about certain things. And so, he was the student of, I think, it was Metzger, Bruce of Metzger, and he's a Bible-believing Christian. And so, Ehrman's disbelief, it comes from a much different place than people who are mythicists and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so, their stuff is just ridiculous.
Huh?
Ehrman's disbelief came from a philosophical perspective. He came from the problem of evil.
Yeah. Problem of evil is a strong argument. It was one of my favorite ones, and I would actually break the problem of evil down into 2 different problems. There's the intellectual problem of evil, which is when you can actually make like a syllogism out of it. And then there's the emotional. And I think the emotional is what most people deal with, and it's the hardest one. But I still think you can answer it as a Christian. But the intellectual problem of evil can be answered pretty simply, but in a way that doesn't seem emotionally satisfying, which is okay because it's not an emotional argument, it's an intellectual argument. But I still think you can answer both of them to at least some degree of satisfaction and prove at least that they don't mean that God can't exist.
Like, there's this atheist apologist we know of who has this very Hovind style approach where in every single debate he'll harp on dead babies and bring up the same Old Testament verses all the time.
Hitchens would do that kind of stuff too. Hitchens
was
into that.
I've always said funny is that they talk about dead babies, and I'm saying, oh, so I'm assuming you're against Planned Parenthood.
Yeah.
And they say, well, no. And I'm like, so you agree that there's at least some situations where killing babies is a good thing?
Well, yeah, and a lot of them are even moral relativists. So I think that's what's interesting to me is that if you try to make the problem of evil argument, but you're a moral relativist, you've kind of conceded objective morality by even trying to make the argument. Because if I knew they were a moral relativist and they tried to make the problem of evil to me, I'd just be like, well, how do you even determine what good and evil are? And what's your standard of good and evil that you're applying to God? And like, if you don't actually take an objective moral standpoint, then really a lot of that stuff, you just can't do it. And so,
my favorite response to the problem of evil is like, why does God let bad things happen to children? I'm like, why does God let good things happen to children? At least he's being consistent.
So for me, the intellectual response to the problem of evil is all you have to do is add one premise. And so you can say, God is powerful enough to stop evil. God is, good enough that he'd want to, and God is knowledgeable enough that he would know how. You just add the premise. But it's possible that God has a morally justifiable reason to allow evil. And boom, as long as it's possible that there's a morally justifiable reason, it's not impossible that God could allow evil. And so it doesn't seem intellectually satisfying, but the point is it proves that it's not impossible. But the emotional problem is harder. But the way I would respond to the emotional problem, which is the one that most common people are dealing with, is by saying that Christianity is unique as a religion in that God had to deal with the problem of evil. Jesus was tortured and crucified and, disrespected and betrayed. So God experienced evil and he took it on himself and used it in a transformative way. And so we can apply that to our lives, where if you want to be like Christ, you can embrace your sufferings and they can be turned into something better. At least what I told different people is that evil is actually more of a problem in a non-believing worldview, because then it's meaningless evil. It's evil with no meaning or possible benefit or upside or anything. But if you're a believer, evil sucks, but at least it might be meaningful. And at least you can do something about it in your life, and it can form you into a better person.
Yeah, without evil, Christianity doesn't make any sense.
Without the devil, Christianity doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or hell.
So, I was also wondering, since you're a Catholic, you must obviously get this a lot, but what's been your reaction and take to the whole Catholic priest scandal?
Yeah, I get that a lot, and I got it before I became Catholic. When people found out, they would say, well, what about this? And I get it now. I have friends who are priests, and so, sometimes I'll mention to somebody, oh, I was hanging out with my priest friend the other day, and we were, talking about this and whatever. We had this bourbon that we had tried or whatever. And they'll be like, oh, well, were you careful? Which is a dumb question, because you can't tell, but I'm 6'5" and 240. So I'm not worried about it. And but that's just, yes, it happens a lot. People bring it up a lot, annoyingly so. But here's what I would say. The first thing I want to say is, before I go any further, I just want to say there's absolutely no justification for any priest to do anything like that. And I think that, the Bible is really clear. Jesus said, it's, if you put a stumbling block before a child, it'd be better for you to have a millstone tied around your neck and be thrown into the sea. So Jesus' response to impeding children from knowing God better, which is what you do if you're a priest and you abuse people because you're the figure of God in their life. I mean, it's obviously bad because it's sexual abuse, but it's even worse because they're priests, and I think that's why people get upset about it. But
while they don't say keep about the secular public school system.
Exactly. So that's what I was going to say. But before I want to say anything that because a lot of times I'll say what I think, and people will be like, "Oh, you're minimizing the issue." Trust me. You know who's the most upset about Catholic priests doing this stuff? Catholics. First of all, we're the victims. It's the Catholic kids that are getting abused, and we're the victims because it puts a bad image on our church. It disrupts people's faith. So we're the victims. So when you talk about Catholics and priests and what they do, you have to remember that you're talking to the victims. And I think a lot of people forget that. But what I would say is, my understanding is that, statistically speaking, Catholic priests are no more likely than any other adult male to be an abuser. It's about 4 to 6% of the population. But the thing is that the Catholic Church is a worldwide institution. And it's a big institution. There's nearly 2 billion of us. So when a Catholic priest does something, it's news everywhere. So everybody hears about it. And there's a lot of people who take joy in putting the Catholic Church down, so they're willing to talk about it. But, when some Baptist preacher in Missouri who has a congregation of 50 does something, it's not worldwide news. So you don't hear about it. It doesn't mean it's not happening, especially when, like you said, there's evidence that 100 times more sexual abuse takes place in American public schools. But you don't hear people talking about public school teachers all the time. And why not? Because their kids are in public school. So people don't like to make fun of institutions that they're a part of, or they don't want to feel bad as parents because they're letting their kids go to public school. The sad fact of it is, Catholics and Christians in general, we believe that people are sinful. And so in every institution where there's a power dynamic, there's abuse of that power. And that's just the sad reality of it. So that's why I think, I won't deny that there's a huge problem. There's a lot of the people who are actually doing the most to uncover the dirt are Catholics. They're the ones who are going in there because they want it out there. They don't want it to hide it, because the longer we hide it, it's just going to keep coming out every 5 or 10 years. And there's this. Yeah.
And did you hear about the until the 80s it was a marry a rapist law or something like that? It's not really known, but sometimes.
So what is that?
Where you I remember it very vaguely, but they try to pretend that their Catholic Church condoned that women are to marry their rapists.
Oh, well, that's ridiculous. Actually, the Catholic Church was the first major world institution that stated that consent is necessary for marriage. So there's a lot of forced marriages and arranged marriages that were prevented because, for example, the Catholic Church, if you aren't consenting, like when my wife and I got married, we had to fill out a notarized form that basically said, I hereby declare that I'm not being in any way persuaded to take part in this marriage or whatever. So yeah, but there's a lot that you could go into that. But one thing I would say is, it obviously is terrible. It's evil. I believe that people who do that kind of stuff are going to be severely judged and that they need to repent. But the thing about it is that a lot of times people will use it as an ad hominem argument.
They bring this up recently because just the other day there's people in the Middle East are considering marry a rapist law.
That's terrible.
That's Islam.
Yeah, that's more frequent in Islam.
Yeah, and that's the thing that people don't talk about either. Is there's this weird alliance between leftists in America and Islam. Leftists will trash Catholics all day long, and then they'll be okay with the religion where they're throwing gays off buildings and women can't go alone in public. And why is there this double standard? You don't really see people.
Supposedly.
Yeah, they're minorities here for now. They probably won't be for long, and with the birth rates and everything and their immigration. But it's interesting because I have a friend who's a priest who's from Nigeria. And the thing about Nigeria is that the northern part of it is basically a Muslim state, and the southern part of it is mostly Christians. And he talks about how if you actually live in a country where half of it is Muslim and half of it is Christian, your eyes are open so much to the realities of the differences between them. Because, they're over there kidnapping hundreds of girls and killing Christians by the hundreds and stuff like that. And because they don't like the evangelization that they're doing, because once people become Christian, the civilization changes so much. And, when Christians come into areas, they want to educate women, or the Muslims can't stand for that.
And there are certain places in Central Africa where where the only type of Christianity they're exposed to is the fundamental variety, and thus they turn out to be terrible.
There's lots of Pentecostals and stuff down there, that kind of stuff. Yeah, but what I would say is, what's interesting is that a lot of people don't realize how much of a coordinated effort it was to actually corrupt the Catholic Church. Like, have you heard of Belladod?
Yeah.
Belladod was a ex-KGB agent, basically, who defected from communism and ended up actually converting to Catholicism. And she testified before the Supreme Court of the United States, or maybe it was Congress or something, but she gave a public testimony that part of her job as a KGB agent was to get thousands of men to infiltrate Catholic seminaries with the specific goal of later on distorting their doctrine and making them look like evil people. And so there's a lot of people, and when she gave the testimony, she talked to different Catholic bishops and stuff, and said that she wouldn't name who she knew of, but that she knew of multiple people who had made it to the highest ranks of the church, who she was personally involved with getting into the church intentionally to sabotage it. So a lot of people don't realize that plays a role, that it's not just like that there's actually a deliberate, and it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but like it's the reason we even know about it is because people who were involved in it directly later testified about it.
Also, I'm just curious, what do you make of Islam?
In general?
Yeah.
I might have to go into hiding if I say what I think about it.
Don't worry, our channel's monetized, don't worry.
I think people, if you look at the actual historical basis for it, you'll have a widely different understanding of it. People have this tendency to view Islam as firstly a religion that has secondarily a political component. But I think if you're historically honest, it's more of an empire that has a religious component. And so, I think that there's a lot of Muslims who have good... Here's what I would say. I think that if Muslims converted to Christianity, that they would put all the other Christians to shame. They're extremely, devout and zealous, and, they pray often. It's part of their religion to pray 5 times a day and everything. So, and I don't dislike them as people necessarily, but as an ideology, I think that it's definitely dangerous. And what's even more dangerous is that it's kind of being put up, like you said, like they're a victim minority, and people will throw things at, like for example, one of the favorite things people throw at Catholics is the Crusades. But people haven't actually looked into the Crusades. Like people don't realize, like people think the Crusades.
And the Inquisition.
Exactly. Well, yeah, that's another good one that is totally misrepresented. But people don't realize that, well, basically what they're taught is that the Crusades was about a bunch of bored white European Christians who had money and decided, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we controlled the Holy Land? And they just decided to go there for no reason and take it over and kill a bunch of people. But what really happened was the Muslims took over the Holy Land, which had previously not belonged to them, considering, that their religion didn't exist until 600 years after Christianity and,
right.
Thousands of years after Judaism, who had originally claimed the Holy Land. And they were killing the non-Muslim pilgrims who would go there. And not only that, but basically by the time that the Crusades happened, the Muslim empire had reached Europe. So it wasn't like the Europeans were just going out of their way. It was mainly an attempt to push them back out, and then they kept going, and on the way decided, hey, maybe we should also not let them kill people who are going to our religion's most holy site. And so, people kind of ignore the fact that it was primarily originally a defensive military engagement. I'm not saying that everything that happened in the Crusades was great, and even the popes at the time didn't think so. They, said, "Hey, we didn't tell you to do that." When the Christians, for example, attacked the other Eastern Christians.
Yeah, and sacked Jerusalem. That was awful.
Yeah. I was also wondering, since you just talked about popes, what is your opinions on Pope Francis?
Oh boy, another one that'll probably have to send me into hiding. Honestly, I think that to put it, I don't want to say anything disrespectful about the Pope, so I'll put it as charitably as I possibly can for now, which is basically that I think that he's said and done a lot of things that are at best ambiguous and at worst very dangerous.
He's gone soft, basically.
Not, I don't know if he's, you could say that he's gone soft, but there's things that he says and does that have a lot of faithful Catholics really concerned. And I think that basically the Catholic Church right now is in a time period. Historically, what happens is whenever there's a major council in the church, Nicaea, Constantinople, whatever, and we just had Vatican II. Usually for like the first 2 generations after a major council, there's kind of like a time period where everything kind of gets figured out again, and people kind of, because usually what a council does is it condemns a specific heresy that was a problem.
Better than a Reformation.
Yeah.
How that turned out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and one of the bad things about that is that the council that responded to Protestantism was the Council of Trent, and it took way too long. Not only did it take too long to start, but there was a bunch of extenuating factors that made it take too long to finish. Actually, it never finished, but it took too long for them to get very far. So I think that if the Catholic Church had responded officially faster, the Protestants' Reformation might have been mitigated a little bit, but that kind of ignores also that there was a huge political component, and people realized, hey, if we don't believe in the Pope, then I'll be the king and I'll get all the taxes, and that'll be neat. What I mean? So like there was a big alliance of secular princes with the Reformation because they realized, hey, that gives me more power, and if I adopt this religion, so that would be neat. What were we talking about? Oh yeah, popes. But the thing about Vatican II is that unlike most councils, it did not meet to specifically address a problem in the church. It wasn't even, and it didn't even pronounce any new specifications of doctrine. It didn't really clear anything up. And even the Pope Paul VI at the time, at the end of the council, said, in Vatican II, we did not intend to exercise our extraordinary magisterial authority, which basically means we didn't mean for this to be specifically teaching anything or clearing anything up. They called it like a pastoral council. It was basically meant to they saw it as a way of like dialoguing with the modern world and finding a way to make the church more relevant or whatever. But if you look at the statistics, since Vatican II, we have less Catholics going to Mass than ever. We have, less priests being formed, and almost all the, religious orders and the monasteries and the nuns are less. I mean, if the stated goal of Vatican II was to make people want to be Catholic more because we were going to be more in touch with the modern world, it demonstrably failed at that. So there's a lot of Catholics today have a lot of concerns about what's been going on since Vatican II, and specifically about what exactly direction Pope Francis is trying to take things in. But what I would say is that as a Catholic, we believe that the church is not only a human institution, and that it was founded by Christ, who is God, and certain promises were given by Christ to the church. For example, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, and the Holy Spirit will come and guide the church into all truth. And we believe that ultimately the church can't go away, or ultimately it won't start teaching things that are wrong. And, there's been tons of terrible times in the church in the past. There was the Great Western Schism when there were 3 or 4 church, and the Avignon papacy, and there was the Arian crisis back in the, 4th century and stuff. So there's a joke about Napoleon Bonaparte was talking to a cardinal, and he said, I'm going to destroy the Catholic Church, as part of my worldwide domination. And the cardinal said to him, hey, we've been trying to do that for the past, 2,000 years. I don't think you're going to be able to do it, because the church is interesting tidbit fact. The papacy, the Pope, the seat of Peter, is the longest lasting office in human history. There's never been a dynasty or a presidency of a country or a monarchy that has lasted longer. Because it's literally, if you believe in Catholicism, it's been since Peter.
But if we're being technical, wouldn't Catholicism go back to the schism when they and the Orthodox split?
Well, if you look at it, you would say from a Catholic perspective that the Orthodox split from the Church, and that
before that they were just one. It was just universal, and Orthodox means straight, and
Catholic means universal, and Orthodox means right believing. And even today, Catholics and Orthodox have a lot more in common with each other than any other type of Christians. And
do you think wait,
Vatican II, Electric Boogaloo.
Pretty much, unfortunately.
One of the reasons Islam's still like bigger than ever is because it retained the old ways. It doesn't try to blend in with the modern world unless it's technology.
That is why there's a huge movement, especially in the younger generations of Catholics, to return to traditional Catholicism. For example, like my wife and I, we go to the Tridentine Mass, the old Latin Mass, the one that people did before Vatican II. And we know there's a big revival in reading things that came out before Vatican II and going back to, the more traditional teachings, like I said, Thomas Aquinas he's pretty much like the beacon of orthodoxy and Catholicism. And what you see is
Aristotle, Plato was
exactly. St. Augustine and
Augustine.
All this stuff. And what you see is a lot of the times, and this is, not a 100% generalized statement, but it's just my observation, is that when you go to churches that are going in the Vatican II liturgy, you a lot of times see less people there, a lot of older people, not a lot of young families with kids that are, going to replace those older people. But the Mass that my wife and I go to, the old Latin Mass, there's literally so many people every Sunday that there's sometimes 20, 30 people or more standing in the back that can't find a place to sit. And that's with the pews being packed. And so, I mean, like, and this is a common theme that we're seeing in Catholicism, is that there's this return to the tradition. The United States Council, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, actually recently posted something on Facebook that said, if you're under 30 years old and you're Catholic and you haven't left the church, why not? And because they were kind of wondering, like, we're losing people so rapidly. What is it that the people who are staying are seeing that's keeping them there? And I looked at the responses, and I read 30, 40 responses in a row, and to the one, every single one said, well, my family started going to the Latin Mass, but we started going to the Latin Mass. I go to the Latin Mass every Sunday. Like, there's like you said, there's something about that. There's a saying, if you marry the spirit of the age, you'll be a widow in the next. So I believe, what I think is this: especially when people convert to Catholicism, like we have, it's a little bit different when you were raised Catholic. But when you become Catholic, a lot of times you'll have an intellectual understanding of Catholicism before you even go to Mass for the first time. And what will happen is people will go to Mass and they'll be like, wait a second, when I was reading Thomas Aquinas and, blah, 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 and this is not what they were talking about. And so when people become Catholic, they want Catholicism. And that's what you get when you go to the traditional Latin Mass. But a lot of times, when you go to a more modernized Catholic Church, it's kind of feels more like, Protestantism a little bit better, or like, a little bit different,
Anything's better than Protestantism. But speaking of which, what's been your experience dealing with fundagelicals as, according to them, a Mary worshiping pagan whore of Babylon? Pagan.
So,
who also believes that, in the cannibalism that is transubstantiation.
Yeah, exactly. I have actually not had a ton of personal experience with them since I left Tennessee. Most of the people that I encounter who aren't Catholics are typically just like secularists who don't care about anything, or they don't have an opinion. But what I will say is that when I was in the process of determining whether or not I wanted to be Catholic, I basically I had a friend who I knew from Tennessee who I was messaging, and I was like, yeah, I'm thinking about becoming Catholic. And he knew someone who was his pastor, basically, who he was like, before you do that, talk to this guy and see what happens. And so for about a year, almost every single day for, hours, sometimes, like, we would get on Xbox or something and just play for hours and go back and forth. We would talk about, here's why I think I'm going to become Catholic and you should too. And he would say, well, here's why I don't think you should become Catholic and why I'm not going to. And it really, when it started out, he did have a lot of opinions about Catholicism that were basically, misunderstandings, and those were cleared up. But he still totally thinks that Catholicism is wrong. But for me, when I was talking to them, it gave me a reason to figure out what we actually believe. And that was actually kind of what pushed me further into it, was every time he would come to me with some sort of, question or accusation, I would have to go, okay, well, let me respond to you tomorrow and I'll research it tonight. And then I would research it and I'd be like, hey, that's not really what the church teaches. And actually what they do teach, it makes a lot of sense to me. And then I would go back and tell them that. So it's kind of been an opportunity for me to expand on my own beliefs. But also there's been a lot of times when I've been able to clarify what the church actually teaches. Because most of the time when, you're a fundamentalist, evangelical, you're hearing only what people in your echo chamber are saying about Catholicism. And you never heard the arguments for other things. Like,
right.
That guy actually, for example, a lot of times what people who are Protestant will say is that Catholics don't read the Bible and stuff like that. They don't know what they're talking about. And well, that guy I mentioned, he actually came to my wedding. He was actually one of my groomsmen. And one of the things that he said afterward was, I was surprised how much the Bible is read at Catholic churches, because if you're familiar with the Mass, there's, 4 different parts of the Bible that are read at every Sunday Mass. If you go to one of the new Masses, which is what I was doing back then. But go ahead.
What's been your experience as a convert, according to your former peers? Like, you were never truly an atheist, or atheists rarely convert unless it's for emotional or not intellectual reasons.
Like I said, the post about me dressing up as Jesus for fictional character day was the #1 post on Reddit when it happened. After not too long ago, I think maybe a year ago now, or I can't remember exactly when, but I'd made an AMA. I did an AMA on Reddit, Ask Me Anything, and I said, I'm the guy who dressed up like Jesus, and now I'm Catholic. And I posted proof that it happened and that I was him, and it got like 800 or 900 comments. And it took up my whole day. I was responding to everything, and a lot of the comments that I got were basically, and it's funny because, like I said, there's a big similarity between fundamentalists, Christians, and atheists. Because if you're a fundamentalist Christian and you leave, what are the Christians going to say? What are the fundamentalists going to say? Well, he was never really saved. He was never really saved. He didn't actually believe in Jesus. He didn't really understand the Bible. And atheists are a lot of the same way. They'll say, well, you never really didn't believe in God, or like you never really understood the arguments against God. But what I found is funny is that a lot of them will make armchair psychological analyses of me. They'll be like, oh, well, you're just a guy who seeks radical beliefs. Or here's what I think is funny. A lot of times when I talk to people, I'll explain to them, I was raised and this is what I believed, and then, this was the progress of my belief system, and then this is where I'm at now. And they'll basically say, well, you just jump around from religion to religion. You won't stay in this one for long. You just like to believe the new thing that you find out about, and like it's a bad thing. But I say, so you're telling me that the bad thing to do is to adapt your belief system to new evidence and experiences and rational, thought. Like, if you believe what you were raised to believe and you've never changed, doesn't that just mean that you were either extremely lucky and happened to be taught by your parents the exact truth about the universe, or you haven't changed your beliefs because you're too stubborn or too ignorant or lazy to do the research?
And this is what I love about it. They'll swear that atheists have higher IQs and religious people have lower IQs. Like, okay, and they'll say that they were a former Christian. I'm like, So your low IQ as a religious person, so your IQ automatically went up when you became an atheist?
Yeah, it is pretty ridiculous, and there's definitely a huge element of pride to a lot of atheism. You know, when you're a lot of times when you, at least when you first become an atheist, or if you're in the particularly militantly atheist or new atheist perspective, I mean, like there's the group of atheists who call themselves brights. They they say we're the geniuses, like and it feeds
Although,
off the.
funny enough, one of the members of the Brights was actually a deist.
Mm-hmm. Because basically anything that's far enough removed from Christianity is considered good enough, because you know at least you're not total idiot. But there is definitely the kind of this
self-congratulatory zeal.
Yeah, self-congratulatory. You know, we figured it out. We're the enlightened ones. Everybody else is idiots. View.
And deists invented that.
Oh yeah, yeah. or like it kind of reminds me of like when you're an anti-theist. That specifically a lot of times comes with the belief that religion has done more harm than good. But when you actually look at it, that's just not true. I mean, like for example, like we were talking about, like obviously the Catholic Church, there's people in it who have done terrible things, but it's just a fact that the Catholic Church is the most charitable organization in the history of the human race. I mean, like there's a reason why so many hospitals are named after saints, and some of the most prestigious universities in the world were originally founded as monasteries. You know, I mean, like if you step back and objectively look at the impact that religion, well, I wouldn't even say religion, I'll say Catholicism, because that's what I'm defending, but even broader than that, you could say Christianity, because obviously I wouldn't say Islam has done a lot of great stuff. But if you're looking at Catholicism and objectively analyzing history to see the differences that it's made, on the whole, it's significantly better. And there's this huge myth about like the Dark Ages when people didn't know things. When, I mean, like the only reason we even know about what Aristotle or anybody back then said, or about Socrates, is because there was a bunch of Catholic monks who spent their lives praying
and Muslim monks
and writing stuff down and keeping track of stuff. But what I would say is that when you say, like, you bring up Muslims, like, what I've noticed is that people will say that there was like this golden age of Islam.
Well, there kind of was, but
well, no, but here's what I think about it. From my understanding, the golden age of Islam happened right after they had kind of taken over a bunch of Christian territories, where there was still a bunch of really smart Catholic monks who were still doing what they were doing and transmitting and copying and keeping records of stuff, and were still being involved. And it wasn't until they either killed all of them, or all the Catholics left, or they converted them all forcibly to Islam, that the golden age ended. I wonder why that is, when there was no more Christians anymore.
It also ended because of the Mongols.
Yeah, and also there was kind of an anti-intellectual stream of Islam that became prominent, and that's the one that you kind of still see now, because there were schools of Islam in the earlier age that were more, they facilitated intellectual pursuit more, but there was a kind of a fundamentalist Islamic stream that became predominant and is still mostly.
And interestingly enough, when Muslims took over, they swept through the lands where civilization itself began, and it's been theirs ever since.
Yeah, like exactly, like the Mediterranean.
Huh?
They have a pretty convincing apologetic tactic. It's called the sword tactic.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or
surprised at how convincing a religion can be once you have a sword up your throat.
Or the tax you out your butt tactic.
Islam is literally a political religion, a militaristic religion.
Yeah, like I said, it's an empire with a religion.
Yeah.
More than it's a religion with an empire. That's the way that I've tended to see it. And you know,
and since you're not fundamentalist, do you think that they worship different God?
What I would say is
instead of just a perverted version of it.
I would say that's the kind of question that you could go yes or no on. Like I said before, Catholics think that we have the 100% truth, but that other religions have certain degree of truth. So the idea of monotheism is obviously a plus for them. They at least have monotheism, and they claim to worship the God of Abraham. So they profess to believe the same God, certainly, but when you get down to it, we believe in the Trinity.
Yeah.
And we believe that Jesus is God.
They think they're worshiping the one God.
They think that they're worshiping the one God, and they're probably closer to it than a lot of people. I'd say further than Jews, but when you believe in the Trinity and you believe that Jesus is God, and somebody says they don't believe in the Trinity and they don't believe Jesus is God, it's hard for me to say, well, yeah, we worship the same God, and I think that's one of the problems that you see in modernist Catholicism today, even to the highest ranks, is this kind of like religious indifferentism. I'm all right, you're all right. We're all doing the same thing.
How would you say that Muslims are closer than Jews are today?
I didn't say that. I said they're further from what Christians believe about God, I think.
Yeah. Right, further.
Yeah. Well, we've actually passed the hour mark. We usually go for an hour in these streams.
It's up to you guys. We could always talk again, or we could keep talking, or...
we can talk.
What's your favorite book of the Bible and least favorite?
I don't know if I have a least favorite. One of my favorites, the first book that I read of the Bible after I became a Christian was Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes,
Brass's favorite.
Yeah, Ecclesiastes is basically the first existentialist work of literature, and it really resonated with me when I read it, and it's unique. It's definitely one of the most unique books of the Bible. It's the one that I think refers least to the supernatural, and so it kind of, a lot of times, if I was going to tell somebody who didn't believe in God to read a book of the Bible, I would say, read this and tell me what you think, because they're going to go into it expecting, what they think the Bible is, and then they're going to read it and be like, there's parts of this Bible thing that are, different than I would have expected. And one of my other favorites is probably Romans. I think Romans is kind of like the major work of Christian theology that you find in the Bible. It's Paul's masterpiece, and
his magnum opus.
Magnum opus, and it's so deep and rich. For me, what I would say is my favorite way to study the Bible is typology. And so that is when, like I said, a type is considered a person, place, or event in the Old Testament that foreshadows something that the New Testament
fulfills.
There's
Joseph, Moses, Samson, David, Elijah.
Yeah, exactly. And all these, or like, for example, from a Catholic perspective, that's a lot of the beliefs about Mary come from typology. For example, we call Mary the Ark of the New Covenant. And so why do we say that? Well, the old Ark of the Covenant, as you know, was this box that was gilded and had cherubim on it and was carried around by the Jews, and it was considered to be the physical presence of God in the world. And it contains three things: the stone tablets of the law that Moses brought down. It contained the manna from heaven that was also kept inside of the temple, and it contained Aaron's staff, which was the staff that miraculously budded when they were trying to figure out who the high priest would be. Now, what did Mary have inside of her, or who did Mary have inside of her when she was carrying Christ? The Word, which corresponds to the tablets of the law, and the bread of life, which corresponds to the manna, and the high priest, which corresponds to the Aaron's staff. And so we would call Mary the Ark of the New Covenant. And what's interesting about that is when, for example, you look at the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 11, the last verse is St. John basically says, "And behold, I saw the heavens open, and the Ark of the Covenant was there." I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he said. And if you were a Jew, you would think, what? The Ark of the Covenant? We haven't seen that for hundreds of years. We don't know where it is. That's like the most important object in all of our religion. Tell us more. What did you see? And that's the last verse of 11. The first verse of chapter 12 is, "And behold, a woman crowned with 12 stars with the moon beneath her feet." And they would say, well, we'll go back to the ark. You said you just saw the ark. But that's really what he's talking about. Mary is the Ark of the New Covenant. Or here's another example. In the Davidic kingdom, you know how like David and Solomon, their dynasty, those kings often had hundreds of wives and concubines.
Yeah.
So who do you think was the queen of the Davidic kingdom? Their mother. The mother of the king was always the queen of the Davidic kingdom, because it would have been confusing, you know, which wife and blah, blah, blah. And so you see this referred to in the Bible every time, with like one or two exceptions. Every time a Davidic king comes into the authority, and the Bible accounts for it, it says, and also his mother, blah, blah, blah. And says, because she was called in Hebrew the Gebi-Ra, which means queen mother. And so we know that Christ was the king in the line of David. Naturally, who would be the queen? Mary. So that's why we get the idea of Mary as the queen of the kingdom and stuff like that. So a lot of the typological study of the Bible is where the uniquely Catholic doctrines come from, and it's what you find when you study the Church Fathers.
Oh, you want to know what happened to the old Ark of the Covenant? Just watch Raiders.
Oh yeah, it's on a mountain somewhere, and you know we can't get to it or whatever. Or like that's what happened to the Noah's Ark. You know, people.
Yeah, a lot of people confuse that.
Yeah.
Fundamentals mostly, they confuse that with the Ark.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though the Ark of Noah, Zui Sudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, whatever you want to call them,
yeah,
was probably a raid shelter.
Like I said, I don't usually try to go into like the historical analysis of to what extent is this, because for me it's not really as important. I think a lot of people will put a lot of stake into this had to physically happen.
No, it's kind of mythologized history, if you want to use that term.
Yeah. So I would never want to say like it definitely wasn't happened in some sense. But I would be more comfortable with focusing on what was the meaning of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was the deeper meaning of it?
Because God has a love for storytelling, as we see throughout the Old Testament.
Or we call it it's called the pedagogical, teaching method. God didn't tell humanity everything that he wanted them to know about himself all at once. And he kind of condescended to them. So that's like when you read the Old Testament, a lot of it seems like what you would expect, an ancient culture to write about. That doesn't seem so miraculous, but that's because God knew where humans were at and that they couldn't understand everything that he wanted them to know all at once. And so he kind of slowly brought them to the point where when Jesus came and fully revealed the nature of God.
Right, and there's fellow Catholic scholar Mark S. Smith. You've heard of him?
Nope, but I'd be interested.
Anyway, he's one of the leading proponents of the theory that the Israelites didn't always know that God was the one God of creation, and that was progressively revealed over time.
I think there's definitely evidence. I mean, how many times did the Israelites revert to paganism? I mean,
yeah,
like when Moses was getting the 10 Commandments, they were having a pagan orgy. That story is really funny actually, because when they built the golden calf, they said they took all the gold and like threw it into the furnace and like formed it. But when Moses comes back down, he's like, "What happened?" And then I think it was Aaron. He's like, "Well, we put all of our gold in this thing, and then this came out like it was an accident." You know what I mean? Like it was like, "Oh, this I don't know." Now that you're here, we thought you weren't coming back. We thought you died up there. So I mean, there's definitely evidence. I think obviously the Israelites knew that that Yahweh was their God, and that he was you could say that they probably believed that he was the main God, but there was a lot of pagan stuff that they had absorbed that took a long time for them to purge. Yeah.
Anyway, you got any future projects you're working on that you would like the audience to know about?
I've had a lot of people ask me to write a kind of longer, detailed account of my conversion and what went into it, because like the stuff that's on my blog was I mostly wrote it as I was learning about it. So it was kind of my way of like processing it, and I would use it as like a conversation starter. I'd be like, "Hey, this is what I'm thinking about." But right now, I've kind of been more doubling down on my prayer and my studying, especially because I mentioned over our emails that my wife is currently pregnant. So I don't really have any plan to like take on any big project. Oh yeah, thank you. But the way I see it is like I'm not going to be in a position to devote a lot of time and energy to anything besides that for a while in the near future. So every once in a while I'll upload something onto the blog, but it kind of just depends, what's on my mind and how much I want to share it with people.
All right. Any final thoughts?
This was fun. Yeah, I enjoyed it. But happy to talk to you guys again about something.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, I like to. I could do this all night. I love talking about this. It's my favorite thing to do, pretty much.
We just might one day.
Yeah, sounds good.
We're interviewing Egyptologists on a Friday and Saturday. We're doing a doubleheader.
Yeah, you could ask them about how it's complete nonsense that Jesus was based off of Horus and stuff like that.
Yeah, based on Krishna, Mithra, and Dionysius, and all that.
Because once you watch the Zeitgeist movie, then you're just a religion expert, aren't you?
And the Da Vinci Code.
Oh yeah.
Remember the book. The intro of the book says all the facts gathered in this story are true.
Does it really? Oh
so
my goodness.
Wait, so.
Oh gosh. Yeah, the Da Vinci Code. There's a lot of people who surprisingly will take that as like the gospel truth. It's ridiculous. People will believe what they want to believe.
Urban had to write an entire book refuting it.
Yeah, and they made a counter documentary to the Zeitgeist movie too, basically saying any Egyptologist that knows anything will say this is bonkers, and you made a lot of stuff up just to kind of make Christianity look bad.
The Hindus didn't steal from Christianity; it was the other way around. Because
or like C.S. Lewis talks about, because C.S. Lewis was an academic specialist of mythology, and basically what he said was the way he saw it was that God allowed for certain myths to emerge in pagan cultures that would make it easier for them to accept Christ when he came. So I mean, like, that's not a ridiculous way to look at it. I mean, like, so you could look at Christianity as like the one true myth. Like, it's the one true myth. It encapsulates all the things.
Like the Jews and the Greeks had to come together, so what they both knew about God would be further revealed in Christ.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm talking about like with the pedagogical ideas that God was setting everything up so that when Christ came, it would be beneficial. Like, for example, it's not an accident that when Christ came, it was during the largest reign at any point in history until then of the Roman Empire, which was also at peace, so that the gospel message could spread fast, because there was this huge expanse, the Pax Romana, and people could, spread things quickly. That's why it was able to do it as fast as it could.
Well, it wasn't so peaceful to the barbarians, but...
Oh, yeah. Within the empire, yeah.
Yeah, within the empire.
And then later on, we could go to the barbarians from there. So there's some interesting stories about that, too. It's like St. Patrick and stuff.
St. Nick, Santa Claus.
St. Nicholas, there's a funny story about him real quick.
Yep, he punched out the heretic.
He punched Arius, yeah. That's the story about Santa Claus I'm going to tell my kids.
Ho, ho, ho.
Ho, ho, heretic. Yeah.
Anyway, this has been Purple Shots, and see y'all next time. Go check out Jeff's blog, which I'll link in the description. See you next time.
Appreciate it. See you soon.